We must continue to refine our ability to determine for ourselves what is solid and what is not, even when we don't always like the answer. Discernment is a synthesis of the mind's reason, the heart's intuitive connection to energy, and the spirit's capacity to know and embody pure higher will. You can't just do it with your heart. That leads to poor judgment over and over again. Follow your heart only, and it will lead you astray. Because it's only 1/3 of our reality-engaging apparatus. Mind is the first we must develop. Intellect, reason, critical thinking, analysis, deconstruction, practicality, creativity, communication, all of them. Heart is the second thing to develop. Connection. Heart is connection. It is the energetic portal through which we merge with other energy systems. Be they people, sunsets, handmade thank you cards, poetry, bald eagles, or esoteric wisdom. Those are all energetic systems. Heart can connect to them, and through this connection can come a profound appreciation and contact. And sometimes we call that love. We can love many people, many things, and many events all at the same time. But that requires a development of energetic bandwidth. If you don't know quite how to love, you can only love one thing at a time. When you do know how, you can love many. You can connect with many things. And when it is shaped with the discernment and the reason of mind, the reality modelling capability of mind, then you've got something. Those two working together. Will is the third and final faculty to develop, and each of these things cannot develop in a proper integrated manner without the preceding disciplines attained. Mind first, then heart, then will. Will brings soul wisdom into the animal. Higher knowledge of realms that we will enter into when our consciousness and spiritual refinement has reached a certain threshold. We can call it, will, the gateway to the higher dimensions, the 4D and 5D worlds. Forget anything above that, they're not relevant right now. Such a high degree of attainment is required before any will transmissions are credible that it begins to show us very clearly why we must look for attainment in those who speak of higher things. Can you feel a trail of wisdom? Can you smell the experience that leads to the esoteric knowledge presented? Because there has to be one. There has to be that trail. Otherwise, there can be no credible higher will. It is either fake or delusional. There is always a feeling to the genuine pathways of esoteric experience. Feet have walked them. The dust is ingrained in the shoes and the clothes. It cannot be faked. It cannot be simulated. You cannot dress up as a pathwalker. You either are one or you are not by your own deeds. The 1828 Noah Webster Dictionary gives us a nice definition of discernment. It says, "The act of discerning, also the power or faculty of the mind, by which it distinguishes one thing from another, as truth from falsehood, virtue from vice, acuteness of judgment, power of perceiving differences of things or ideas, and their relations and tendencies. The errors of youth often proceed from the want of discernment." Isn't that good? Better than the modern dictionary definitions. Because it was more important in those days, in many ways, to have this discernment. Everything was new here in the States, and much had to be determined and gauged for oneself. There wasn't quite the army of researchers and think tanks that the modern statesman has behind them these days. I say that thinking of the president at the time and how different that role is from the one we have today. You know, those men had to foster their own personal ongoing education in themselves. Not just some hokey degrees from the big universities, but some real, solid life learning in your flesh. So how's your history? Who was the president then in 1828, the same year as our Noah Webster definition of discernment? Who was it? Who was that sixth president? It was John Quincy Adams. And this was in the days before party polarization, so his political affiliation was actually that of Democrat-Republican, hyphenated. And this group was set up by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and it opposed the Federalist Party. Interesting. The Federalists at that time wanted a centralized bank with all sorts of taxes and licensing, and they wanted strong connections with Europe. Jefferson condemned that shit, and in particular it is said the bank and what is known as the implied powers. Jefferson said that the Federalists were selling out Republican values to the British royalty and the old powers of Europe. And he was right. He was right. Wasn't he? So you can imagine how people living at that time, men in that position, would need huge discernment to keep themselves clear and strong and inspired. John Quincy Adams died in 1846 in the Capitol building in DC, and his final words were these: "This is the last of earth. I am content." And with that, he died, and his wife and his son were at his side. Good final words, those. So how did we get from channeling to John Quincy Adams? Discernment. It was, to me, a bit of a golden age, that Georgian and Victorian era. I've said that previously in regard to literature. But also for the autodidactic impulse, self-learning. Certainly for those lucky enough in those times to have a few quid and a bit of time to spare and a few friends. Great luxuries, really. But there were good days if you had those things. The roots of today's remembrance of personal sovereignty point back to that time. Certainly here in America. In Britain, we can add another few hundred years onto that, maybe 1,000 or two, if you really want to look into the history of it. But I'm talking today, where I am, here in the States. And here, that spirit of the Republic, established to distance itself from the brutality of empire, is alive. Imperfect, but present. And discernment is part of what keeps it active. And though empire intended to reclaim the American Republic sooner, much sooner, believe me, that plan has gone awry. Because not only have the Americans shown an unusual resilience to control, but so have many of my countrymen, and many Europeans and Africans and Australians and New Zealanders and Asians, people from all over. They have also felt the truth of the sovereign life to be our own authority, to be our own community, to govern ourselves. Can we embody sufficient courage and discernment to do that? So let me leave you with the words, the very fine words of Theodore Roosevelt, spoken in 1907. Men must govern themselves, or they must submit to being governed by others. If from lawlessness or fickleness, from folly or self-indulgence they refuse to govern themselves, then most assuredly, in the end, they will have to be governed from the outside. They can prevent the need of government from without only by showing that they possess the power of government from within.